Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
Very significant market, long-term relationships there. Anything that would impact that is obviously of huge concern.
Canada stares down 35% tariffs from the United States set to come into effect Friday. One Montreal think tank suggests Canada might benefit from dropping all tariffs unilaterally.
The smell of fresh potatoes used to hang thick in the air around these packing sheds, a sign that another truck was about to roll south toward the US border. Now the sheds feel still, the conveyor belts quiet, and the workers waiting for orders that never come. In just a few short months, more than 140,000 tons of Canadian potatoes have stopped crossing into American markets. And while fields sit full, Canada's Prime Minister has sealed a $1.6 billion trade deal with Asia, opening new doors while old ones begin to close. The steady rhythm of goods moving between the two neighbours is starting to falter. Is this a passing slowdown or the start of a long-term shift? And if it's the latter, what could it mean for meat, grain and America's role in the global supply chain? Let's break it down. Agriculture is often thought of as steady ground in an uncertain economy, yet even in a sector built on staples like potatoes, small changes in market flow can uncover much larger movements beneath the surface. In 2024, Canadian growers sent more than 350,000 metric tons of potatoes to the United States. That is the equivalent of roughly 17,500 refrigerated containers, each carrying around 20 tons. The number is more than a statistic. It represents decades of steady cross-border trade between neighbours whose economies have been intertwined for generations. By the second quarter of 2025, that flow had weakened dramatically. Export volume had fallen by more than 40%, stripping almost 140,000 tons from what had been a dependable stream. For perspective, the lost supply could have met the yearly potato needs of over 17 million American households covering the entire northern belt from the Midwest to New England. The striking part is the absence of any formal announcement from Ottawa. There were no new regulations, no official bans. The slowdown appeared quietly in fewer contracts signed, in farmers shifting planting plans, and in supply lines running at idle. It was a contraction playing out in actions rather than words. The most direct cause took shape south of the border. On April 2nd, 2025, the US government enacted a sweeping tariff schedule on imported goods. For Canadian potatoes, the new rate meant a 25% duty on fresh seed and frozen varieties stacked on top of a baseline 10% import tariff. The effective rate of up to 35% pushed landed costs higher by 8 to 12 cents per pound, depending on the type. A frozen French fry shipment worth $32,000 now arrived with an additional bill exceeding $11,000. Wholesale prices shifted upward quickly. A £50 bag that once sold for $22 was suddenly closer to $30, a near 35% rise in one quarter. For restaurants, the change cut deep. A portion of fries that had cost $3.50 now ran $5.25, the same $10 that once covered nearly 3 servings now barely bought 1.5. Some adjusted menus, others cut portions, but the effect reached far beyond the dining room. American importers began reducing orders or replacing them with domestic supply, even when the quality or processing efficiency fell short. Canadian processors like McCain and Cavendish, heavily dependent on the US market, reduced raw potato contracts. Farmers in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick and Alberta, Canada's top potato growing regions, scaled back planting for 2025. Mid-sized farms reported expected yield drops of 15 to 25%, not from shortages of land or labour, but from dwindling demand. For Canadian producers, this loss of market share came with an unexpected opening. In regions like PEI, where 2/3 of potatoes normally head south, more growers began selling domestically or shifting into shorter supply chains. Instead of bulk containers, more crops were being packed into smaller retail bags for local supermarkets. This approach raised the value per pound while feeding small-scale processing and packaging operations in rural communities. For Canadian consumers, a surplus at home meant steadier prices. A £5 bag that once sold for $4.99 remained near that range, avoiding the steep spikes seen in other foods like red meat or imported grains. Some of the excess found its way into community food programs. In provinces such as New Brunswick and Manitoba, initiatives bought surplus potatoes at subsidized prices for distribution to food banks and relief kitchens. The savings were tangible. A household cutting $5 a week from its potato costs could redirect that toward milk, eggs or bread, other staples touched by inflation. In an era when every dollar stretched matters, such savings carried weight. Moreover, this episode raised a larger question plan for Canada should any agricultural sector depend so heavily on a single export destination. More than 92% of Canadian potato exports had gone to the United States. A single policy shift in Washington was enough to jolt the entire supply chain. That reality fueled a quiet but deliberate diversification. Trade officials began making rounds in Indonesia, the Philippines and Panama. These were smaller markets compared to the US, but potentially steadier, with fewer political crosswinds. Within the industry, the sentiment was clear. The United States had once been the most reliable buyer. Now it was becoming a market where policy could turn overnight and loyalty no longer guaranteed stability. The shift was already visible in US towns near the border. A Minnesota restaurant owner described how, after April, orders from his Canadian supplier stopped abruptly. The 25% tariff had erased profitability, forcing a switch to domestic potatoes that cost more and cooked poorly. Fries arrived soggier, oilier, less consistent. Cost per bag rose from $12 to $16, pushing menu prices up, and customers noticed. Complaints came in. Revenue dropped, and the same pattern emerged across distributors in North Dakota and Wisconsin. Some halted distribution altogether for a time, unable to find affordable supply. Even larger chains began to feel the strain. McDonald's and Wendy's suppliers, including McCain and Lamb Weston, could no longer maintain earlier price points. The supply chain was being pressured from both ends. Tariffs raised costs for processors, but consumers resisted higher menu prices for a food seen as basic and affordable. The result was a squeeze where neither side could easily absorb the hit. In the United States, some growers benefited from reduced Canadian competition, particularly in Idaho, Washington and Oregon. Prices for their potatoes rose from 6.5 cents to over 8 cents per pound at the farm gate, yet higher input costs, fertilizer, pesticides, fuel, eroded gains. Much of that input still arrived through Canada, now carrying the same 25% tariff. Diesel for farm machinery climbed above $6 a gallon, up from $4.80 a year earlier. Margins for many farms stayed flat or dipped slightly. The ripple effects touched exports too. About 20% of US potato output normally goes abroad, much of it to Canada and Mexico. Those flows now face friction, raising fears of oversupply at home and downward pressure on prices. For consumers, the changes were visible in store aisles. Food prices climbed 3% over the 12 months ending June 2025, with root vegetables among the leading contributors. Inflation hit 2.7% in June alone, in part due to tariffs. The average US household consuming about 45 pounds of potatoes a year now paid roughly $5 more annually for fresh varieties and another $15 to $20 for processed products like chips or frozen fries. Small amounts for some, but meaningful for fixed-income households already stretched thin. Some analysts framed this as a temporary market shock. Others saw it as the clearest sign yet of a fraying North American trade network that had once been smooth and predictable. If a crop as unassuming as potatoes could be disrupted so easily, what might happen with meat, dairy or grains? The stability many had taken for granted no longer seemed certain. Canada's moves abroad made that point clear. In 2025, Prime Minister Carney signed an agricultural trade deal worth about 1.6 billion Canadian dollars focused on processed goods and premium agricultural products. Three nations stood out: Japan, South Korea and Indonesia. With Japan, Canada continued expanding its processed potato market, especially frozen fries, through companies like McCain. South Korea, still closed to fresh potatoes due to quarantine rules, showed growing interest in processed foods. Indonesia, home to over 275 million people and rapidly urbanizing, became a notable buyer. In 2024 alone, PEI shipped nearly $8 million in fresh potatoes there. Whether the Asian market could fully replace the US remained uncertain. It might never match the sheer volume, but it offered Canada more choices and reduced vulnerability. In a global market where policies could change with an election or a single piece of legislation, options could prove as valuable as sales. And if even something as unassuming as a potato is no longer a sure thing, what else can we count on in today's global trade landscape? Tell us in the comments below, subscribe for more, and see you in the next one.